If your ambulance service is performing three-card Monty-style round robin CQI audits on your patient care reports, this show is for you. Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a splendid day. He's Paul Gerard. I am Kevin Kelly. We are Gerard and Associates. Check us out at the website at www.gerardassociates.com. This is the GNA Way EMS CQI podcast. Check us out on Podbean and all the others. We're grateful that you have tuned in. Hey, Paul, the GNA Way is a culmination of 20 years of dirt dog in the trenches, CQI, PCR audits, and one-on-ones that our team has performed. And it's not uncommon, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, to run into EMS ambulance services that use this round robin style of EMS CQI. And let's define that out of the starting gate. How you doing, buddy?
Yeah, I'm doing good, doing good. So yeah, this is a topic, this is a phrase that you and I coined in our phone conversations, right? And it's basically, us labeling a style of CQI that we see fairly frequently and get a lot of calls from folks with comments, concerns, and complaints about the process and why their process isn't working and asking us for help. And so for those who don't know, what we're referring to is round robin is the CQI style where you have multiple people involved in the CQI process, in particular when it comes to speaking with providers, field providers, to help them improve their care. And the typical scenario is where perhaps you have, let's say, for example, a fire-based system. We have 4 groups, right? Group A, B, C, and D, 1, 2, 3, 4, or whatever. And Group A reviews the run reports from the previous shift, Group D or whatever, and then does some sort of critique and then feeds that feedback back to somebody who goes back to the providers to discuss it. And so that's what we're referring to in terms of round robin, where you get a variety of different people looking at other groups' run reports. We see it with privates too, where they have a day shift, an evening shift, and an overnight shift, or a weekend and a weekday shift, and you have folks from one of those groups reviewing the runs from other groups.
Yeah, back in the day, though, I recall us doing that. For example, you would right, we working on the truck. It was a non-transport truck. We'd do our paperwork. We'd come back at the end of the shift. We'd put it in a box, and then the oncoming shift would review that paperwork. We weren't tracking data and tracking for trends and feedback, but it was a lot of ball busting and education-based hazing.
Yeah, it wasn't really CQI. It was really ball busting and education-based hazing. So there was no formal, that wasn't the formal process that the people reading your run report were going to critique you and come back formally and say, Kevin, you should have ALS that guy, type of thing. It was more of us just kind of informally reviewing this stuff and chatting it up and talking about it to try to learn what we could from it. But today it's what people use as a formal process, and it's problematic in a lot of ways unless you do it properly, and you have some systems and subsystems in place to make sure that it works properly. So yeah, this is a little bit more formalized than back in the day when we just read each other's run reports so we could bust each other's balls about their patient care.
Yeah, you missed the tube. How could you miss the tube on that?
Yeah,
you missed the line.
That. Yeah,
I would have got that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wait a minute, you're calling that AFib? That's
Right.
clearly VFib.
Right. Any idiot knows that.
Right.
So,
and you're saying that's not the way to go.
That's not the way to go. So yeah, in today's system, hopefully CQI has progressed to the point where it's more sophisticated than that. But in EMS, CQI is not very progressive. We don't have very sophisticated CQI processes in general as a profession, unlike hospitals and other groups where they spend a lot of time and money and energy. The fact is that Starbucks probably spends more on their quality control department than EMS does, and that's making a cup of coffee versus saving patients' lives. But McDonald's, Starbucks, all the big boys, they spend millions to do quality improvement to make sure that their product's high quality. And in EMS, we don't spend a whole lot. We underfund it all the time, and as a product of that underfunding, we come up with creative, albeit ineffective, methods for doing CQI, and this round robin technique is one of those.
So, Boeing, for example, speaking of high quality CQI of
Yeah.
late, this
Yeah.
would be tantamount to Gerard's shift is the morning shift, Kelly's shift is the night shift. And Gerard's job is to CQI Kelly's workers on how they bolt in those emergency doors,
Yeah.
right? And my job is to CQI Gerard's emergency door bolters.
Yeah.
And we're supposed to be helping each other out, improving quality. Yet sometimes the door blows off.
Yeah. 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 It shouldn't, but it does.
But it
So,
does.
yeah.
So that's not going away.
No.
Oh, hopefully
Well,
the door's blowing off. Hopefully
yeah,
it goes away. But
right.
Round Robin CQI
Yeah.
isn't going away. As
Yeah.
you mentioned, it's I guess a cost effective efficiency
Yeah.
aspect of doing that. But there are horrible hazards, at least in my view,
Hmm.
of non-standardization
Bingo.
of that process.
Bingo.
So how do we mitigate that? It's not going away. We got to help
Yeah.
our colleagues out there. What do you
Well,
what do you suggest?
it is going away to some degree. It's pretty common when people call and they're interested in our services. We have a pretty detailed discussion, and I'll always ask them, "What are you doing now for QA? How's your process now?" And most people have some form of this round robin process. And when I explain to them the reasons that is not always a good process, they almost always say, "That's why we're calling you. It's just not working." And all the things that you said that are potential problems we're experiencing. And the number one problem with that process is that, as you mentioned, is lack of standardization. So you got the officer or supervisor or manager on Group A who's reviewing Group B's run reports, and EMS and patient care in general is a subjective process, right? So, we can pull a run report and I can review it and say, I can't believe you didn't ALS that guy. You could review it and say, yeah, I don't see the need for ALS on this guy. So when you have this round robin technique going on, you have one group reviewing some other group stuff, and they go back and say, hey, you should have ALS this guy. And the manager of the recipient group says, nah, I disagree. And I'm not going to tell my guys he needs to ALS these guys. I disagree with you. And it becomes really a matter of opinion. And that complicates things tremendously because now you don't have any standardization, right? You've got everybody kind of each group doing their own thing. In effect, you come up with 4 different CQI processes with different rules to follow in terms of how people should be treating patients. And obviously that's not ideal because even though one group might be doing superior, another group might be doing inferiorly, and your CQI process just isn't evening that out. So you got to standardize that to a large degree, and that requires oversight, right? So if you're going to use that sort of technique, one of the things you need to do is you need to have some sort of oversight CQI committee or something that these people report to, and that committee's job is to create standardization so that all 4 groups or 3 groups or whatever you're using are viewing things the same way, both in terms of how they audit the run report, how they isolate and pick out issues, as well as how they provide feedback to individual providers. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done there, though, because you got to get everybody on board so that they can then go out and talk to the field providers and give good discussion on why you're expecting them to do what you want them to do.
A committee. I love that idea.
Yeah.
The committee aspect harkens back to my days in compliance and privacy at some of the biggies. And if there's anything that works to move a ball, it's a committee. Now,
Yeah.
This harkens back to that whole notion of the effectiveness of a compliance program. And it begs the question, what is an effective CQI program?
Right.
Well, part of that effective CQI program is having some type of governance and oversight. And you and I are a huge fan, as well as the Commission on Accreditation of Ambulance Service and probably NEMSQA and all NAEMSP,
Mm-hmm.
of having a physician medical director
Mm-hmm.
on that committee,
Right.
and leading that CQI medical care, patient care governance and oversight.
Yeah, well, again, you got that medical director is the person, the man or woman who's charged with making sure you're doing things the right way, or at least the way they want you to do it. Because remember, every medical director, this is a subjective process. So you can send those same run reports to two different medical directors, and they'll come up with two different answers as to how they want you to handle that call. So, but that's the role of the agency's medical director, is to slice that hair and to say, here's how I want you to do it in this system under my guidance, under my leadership. So that person needs to be in that committee, because when you have these four individuals who are reviewing various groups sitting in that committee, and one says, I can't believe your guys on your group didn't ALS that patient, and the retort is, that's bullshit. There's no need to be ALSing that. That's clearly a BLS call. I can't believe you're suggesting that I go tell my guys to ALS that patient when they don't need ALS. The medical director is the person who weighs in and says, I want that patient ALS, so there's no need for ALS in that patient. So having the medical director actively involved, and this is a way to get them involved, right? Bring them into the monthly or biweekly meetings or something, bring them in on a regular basis and have these discussions so that you can iron out these issues so that the CQI program can work at its peak effectiveness.
In addition to that, and what the medical director has to be involved in, is the development, implementation of EMS CQI policies and procedures. So
Right.
if you're going to do round robin, you got to standardize the round robin process, but the medical
Correct.
director has got to be on board with that. And the call as to whether or not a patient should have been ALS to BLS, well, that's ultimately at the hands of the medical director. But based on statewide treatment protocols, that ought to be fairly clear as to whether or not a patient requires ALS or BLS.
I disagree with that. The protocols are sufficiently vague that under any given protocol, you can find some sort of vagueness in that protocol where a patient presentation may not ideally fit within that protocol. And then you got to get a little creative. And in fact, we've had this discussion with at least one OEMS medical director who runs the whole state's OEMS program, the medical director for the state. And he had said, we can't possibly create protocol that addresses every instance of what can go on out there in the field. There'd be a 4,000-page document. It just would be unwieldy. So the protocols give the most common occurrences, the most, when you're talking about a chest pain protocol, it gives you the common presentation. It gives you some caveats and pearls of wisdom in there about don't get you fooled by certain things. But then there's always a line in there that says, if in doubt, or if this is vague or uncertain to you, contact online medical control and get the real answers. And then the system is built to have service medical directors, because if the protocol answered all those questions, you wouldn't need a service medical director. Everybody could just go back to the protocol and say, well, you just didn't do what's in the protocol. What's the need for a medical director if that's the case? So the system's really not designed for the protocols to be that black and white that they can encompass the answer to every given situation out there. And because of that, there's always going to be interpretation issues. So even with well-written protocols, we see folks who read the protocol and says, I don't think that's what that means. I think it means something different. So yeah, you can't rely solely on your protocols. It's a valuable piece of the pie of the puzzle, but it's not going to be the end all encompassing. Every answer you need is in the protocol.
Can you think of a patient care scenario under the chest pain protocol that wouldn't get to some level of ALS?
Yeah, you could have a patient who has has chest pain by definition. Mm-hmm. My chest hurts, but it's highly suspicious to be non-cardiac. And we see this every day, all the time, multiple times a day, where the paramedics will review the patient and say, I don't think this is cardiac, and therefore I'm not going to give him an aspirin and nitro. And upon further review on the QA side of things, you're reading it and you're going, well, it might not be cardiac, but there's certain risk factors here that maybe you should have treated it cardiac, even though it's not certain that this patient is cardiac. And that is true of any patient, right? And is it CHF or is it asthma? And sometimes it's clear cut, other times not. So what this brings up, Kevin, is the Paul Gerard sliding scale of options. So the sliding scale of options is you got a chest pain that on this end, pale, diaphoretic, clutching his chest, feels just like my previous heart attack. And you've got EKG ST elevations throughout your 12 lead. 99% of providers would say that's cardiac and I should treat it cardiac. Interestingly, 1% would still miss it. But the vast majority of people would look at that and say, yeah, cardiac all day long. I got to treat it cardiac, textbook cardiac, treat it cardiac. The other side of the sliding scale is that 35-year-old chest pain patient where the pain is non-cardiac sounding, it's mid-axillary, and it happens when I was playing basketball and I jumped up for a jump shot and I felt a little pop in the side of my chest here and it hurts me now. And they're young, they're healthy, have no medical history. It's not described as sounding cardiac in nature. And the totality of the assessment indicates it's probably not cardiac, but it came in as chest pain. So that now 99% of people who see that patient perhaps would not treat it cardiac, although there is one person out of that 100 who would treat it as cardiac. And then those are the obvious ones. Those are the easiest ones that most people get right most of the time. But as the sliding scale starts to narrow, you take that patient who has nothing, and instead of them being 35, they're 75. Okay, there's a risk factor, maybe a 12 leads in order here. Now that patient, you say, well, that guy's saying that pain, even though it's odd, is similar to his heart pain that he had when he had his MI a few years ago. Okay, now you're sliding further up the scale. As you slide further up the scale, different people start to change their minds and their opinions about whether that's cardiac treatable or not. And that's the gray zone that QA works in all the time. And that's when you have round robin QA, you have different people reviewing that report who might come up with different answers. So it makes it a challenge. And it makes it a challenge when you have 4 different CQI programs within your department by group, advising the clinicians in the field, advising them on how they should treat those folks, and you're getting different answers.
What about and I know we see this, but the biasness of we talk about the 4 C's, but you and I are fairly competitive people, and we're gonna kind of want to one up one another in our round robin CQI efforts at Boeing.
Right.
I certainly want to see a little more screws on my doors than Gerard.
Well, I've had less doors blow off than you have. So.
Well, that's true. Yeah. Well, in fairness, you've had the same doors blown off. It's just they haven't been covered in social media like mine have. So
yours a high profile.
That's right. I tend to. Yeah.
Mine a low profile. Yeah.
But yeah, it's an opportunity for you and I to overlook or downplay errors, and we have a personal relationship. We want to avoid conflict, so that factors in and undercuts, and I believe it totally undercuts objectivity.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge problem, and. Sheesh, we got a high-profile trial in Massachusetts with a couple of our colleagues on the stand. You want somebody other than those that you have a personal relationship with, eyeballing these medical legal documents.
See, that always comes into play, and that's the second major difficulty in doing round robin CQI is that the personalities come into play. So now instead of having a one CQI officer who goes and does the feedback to providers and keeps the message the same, providers sometimes love or hate that guy, right? And mostly hate him because nobody likes the Q. There's no love for the CQI guy, right? CQI guys are not.
That's not what you tell me. I mean, you.
Well. Everybody loves Paul. How can you not love Paul?
You're like the Pearl Jam of CQI.
Pearl Jam. Wow, that's a reference. I gotta make a stretch to connect those dots. But anyway, so now you interject 4 personalities into that equation, and I don't know about you, but every EMS agency I've ever worked with, and it certainly goes on in those 4 group fire departments as well as privates and hospital-based and everybody else, is that everybody has an opinion of the 4 group leaders of those 4 groups. That guy's a stickler.
Right.
for detail. This
Yeah.
guy's loosey-goosey and lets you do whatever you want to do.
Right.
This guy's an asshole. He's always busting my balls about something. Can't stand him. And now he's reviewing my stuff. So you interject now 4 personalities into this process, and that becomes very problematic. It becomes problematic when those 4 CQI manager folks, supervisory folks, don't get along with each other. And now you're going to tell me my guys have a problem? Or what about your guys last week who did something similar? So it can really muddy the waters to the extent that it makes your CQI process completely ineffective in some cases, or certainly so dysfunctional that it creates a lot more stress and anxiety on the part of your providers. So again, that's something that you have to manage. If you're going to use that kind of system where you have multiple people overlooking somebody else's work and then giving an opinion about it, you're going to have to come up with a way to get rid of all of those influences, all those personalities.
Yeah, they call it peer review, and you want your peers reviewing. And we harken back. And first of all, I got off the truck before there was any formal QA. I mean, it was really just round robin. It was on the fire department. I mean, so, and even during my evolution as chief at Webster, it was still, more or less my deputy doing the QA and the run reports. But, we weren't doing every one. We were doing every couple, and we put our focus into monitoring and auditing and teaching, coaching, and mentoring customer service. But now it's a whole different ball game. Too much of an opportunity for hiccups and career costing hiccups.
Yeah.
And you just can't to the best. And I know I go out there, I do these cast site reviews, and they do and some of them do some form of round robin CQI, and they completely mask the PCR. So you don't know who you're reviewing. But there's always phraseology and certain words and things like that.
Time and dates. Just look up who's on duty that day.
Well, you can do that as well.
But, so there's ways to get it.
Right, but they attempt to mask all of that and make it as seemingly as objective as possible. But you can't. You still can't get to that ultimate peak of objectivity unless you get somebody from the outside who's got no personal relationships with anybody doing that.
Right.
So that way, that's something that you need as well. And the other thing, is objectivity, but fear of reprisal and retaliation, and those thoughts and those voices in paramedics' head that get in the way of getting honest feedback and giving honest feedback. Fear that they'll be retaliated against, or the relationship would be strained. It's always a difficult process to have a conversation with either a peer or subordinate about an opportunity to improve. And we spent 20 years developing the 4 C's to get us to that framework where we can do it more positively than not. But I just would be constantly it'd be a constant voice in my head that workplace injustice would be at play. It would be some kind of right, wrong, or indifferent, reasonable or unreasonable. That there exists the notion of workplace injustice based on relationships and who's related to who and who's playing nookie with and kissy face and canoodling with who. Right. And that exists.
Yeah. Well, again, with that round robin technique, you have the ability now to first of all, you have more personalities involved, which makes things more complicated. But the other thing is, if you don't like the answer one person has given you, you have the ability to try to go and influence the other person, right? So, it's kind of, mom didn't give me what I wanted, told me I can't have ice cream, so I'm going to go talk to dad. So the problem you also have is that the whole discussion gets a little bit corrupted by the politics of the situation as opposed to sticking to the patient care of the situation. So, so there's a lot that needs to go on if you're going to use the round robin technique, and there's a lot of parts of it that you have to mitigate in some fashion in order to make it work even reasonably well.
In addition to the policies, the procedures, the medical director-led governance and oversight, at some point you got to have an effective education and training program. And you got to train these CQI auditors or who's
Yeah.
ever doing you have to train them on these standards,
Correct.
and you
Correct.
got to get. Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's you're summing it up great. I mean, that was actually my next point. I was going to bring it up if you didn't. Is that the other big piece of this is the education of your personnel. In our system, we separate our auditor and coordinator job functions. So the auditor's role is simply to review the run report and identify any opportunity for improvement on that run report. Not looking for errors. We're looking for any opportunity for improvement. The coordinator's job is to take that material and then go back to the providers and engage them in discussion and discuss the pros and cons of that audit, and to come up with, while working with the individual provider, what the real answer should be given the context of that specific call. So they have two different functions. In that round robin scenario we're talking about, oftentimes that person who's supposed to be in charge of the CQI process for that group is both the auditor and the CQI coordinator. And really, in order to get a good audit, you have to spend a lot of time training auditors how to audit a run report properly. And in order to get a good coordinator, you've got to train coordinators how to be a good coordinator, an effective communicator, and how to get the bias out of the program to the degree that you can, and how to talk people off the ledge. So whenever you call them in the office, it's not the worst thing in the world. Let's just talk.
Right.
So there's significant training. So if you have that one person doing both jobs, you've got to double up on the training that you've got to give that person in order to make them adequate. And then you got to multiply that times 2, 3, 4, or 5, however many people you've got doing that. So education is the other big piece of this. You hit it right on the head. Is that even though if you have that overarching committee or group and medical director involvement in that group, and you've done all the other pieces that we've kind of spoken of already to get rid of bias and whatnot, you still have to add that educational piece to it.
And another piece of this that I think needs to be considered is lines of communication.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a round robin CQI style, who do you go to?
Yeah.
You go to the A platoon commander if you have a question. You go to the B. Is the question going to be the same? Do you go to the medical director? So, another, and I'm a huge fan of having a one-stop shopping, like almost like a compliance program hotline.
Yeah.
Where if you got an issue, boom. And I get it, you're in the field, that's the medical director. But after, or if you have a question about something that happened on a call, you do have the ability to file an amended PCR. So if something comes up in your head and you have a question, or you zigged and you should have zagged, who do you call? Who do you call from advice? Who do you call if you want to report that, hey, Gerard's team, you're supposed to be using a flathead screwdriver to screw those bolts in. Gerard says, based on some study, he's using some kind of hex quasi Phillips head kind of screwdriver. I just don't know. I have stock in Boeing. I can't have that.
Yeah.
So
again, another piece of the infrastructure for that is you got to have that go-to person, and it's not the group. Again, when you with these smaller departments that don't have these vast resources, and again, we'll use kind of that fire department where you got platoon A, platoon B, C, and D. That platoon leader, that captain, battalion chief, whoever is the person in charge of that group who's charged with doing this, they're the go-to for all CQI things. So if you don't get along with that person, or you feel that they're riding you inappropriately, who do you go to? So with a CQI process that is well developed, you want to have the provider have the ability to question these things in a non-threatening manner. So that's, as you mentioned, a hotline kind of thing, or, what we consider ourselves as kind of outside, we're outside advisors, right? So we have no formal authority within the organizational structure. And we create relationships one-on-one with the providers as we work with them. So providers feel comfortable calling us up and saying, hey, here's what's going on. Here's my concern. Here's my issue. And most of them are pretty honest with us about their thoughts and feelings of a given call, even when they know that those thoughts are wrong. They oftentimes can accept it pretty well. But part of our design is that, listen, you don't have to agree with me. You don't have to listen to me just because I'm saying to listen to me. The next step is, if you disagree with this, if I'm saying, hey, you should have ALS that guy, and you say, no, I completely disagree with you. The next thing is, we can have medical direction weigh in on this, even if it's not a call that they've reviewed already. We can send them an email, hypothetical, meet with them, whatever we need to do, and say, hey, we've got some disagreement here. So in our process, we encourage debate, and we encourage people not agreeing with it. It's okay not to agree with us, because we want to know that you understand and you're not just yesing us just to get out of the meeting. So, and because it's a highly subjective process, you never know what the answers are going to be. It's always worth that extra effort, that extra step.
Yep.
To get that final answer from your medical director, because he or she is the final answer, other than a lawsuit or the state coming down to investigate. Within the daily context of an EMS organization, that medical director's answer is the final answer usually. So your process has to have that ability, and people have to be comfortable using it. In some systems, they're not. So whatever that platoon leader, battalion chief, captain, lieutenant, supervisor, manager, whatever their title is, when they say something to you, you oftentimes feel pressured to do what they want, even if you disagree with it, just so that you don't rock the boat too much and get yourself in trouble.
Yeah, totally agree with that. It's that whole having this audit oversight and all of the psychology that goes along with that, amongst your peers, and how do you break ties? Who makes the final call?
Right.
You got some medical directors, unfortunately, are more interested in being a peer paramedic pal than they are actually being a medical director.
Right. Or absent altogether. They just don't put any effort in. They don't want you coming to them.
No. And as part of the effective lines of communication, access to data. We got folks out there that are interested in how they are doing, but they're not getting reports, or they're certainly not getting the level of detail in the reports that they ought to be getting in order to move the ball.
Right.
One of the hallmarks of the GNA way is the objective scoring system. Mm-hmm. You go in with a baseline, and you might get a little butthurt when you first see it. But the good news is, if you go into these one-on-ones with a positive attitude and say, make me a star, Paul, make me the Babe Ruth of giving blood as a paramedic.
Right.
We want that baseline, and we want to be batting 300.
Right. And the data's broken out so that it's relatively simple to understand, and you can see. We've had providers who have negative scores, right? So we can meet together. You did 50 patients last trimester that you were the primary tech for, and your score is a negative 24, on our scoring index. And people kind of flip out a little bit when they see that at first. But the reality is, it doesn't scare us, because it's what's within the data that we can fix that will make that number jump. And usually it's one or two things that the provider's doing consistently on every patient, that if you just change that one issue, the score jumps significantly, because their patient care is not bad. It's just that they're doing one or two things that they shouldn't. So one of those things is typically extricating the patient out to the truck before starting care at the patient's side, which most protocols require you do now. And yet a lot of providers still like to scoop and get out to the truck and do everything on the way to the hospital. So if your protocol, if you are dead on with every protocol, you properly assess and properly treat every patient, but you extricate 100% of them out to the truck, you're going to have a really bad score, a really negative number. You fix that one issue and you're a superstar. Next trimester, your score's a 98, so you're a superstar.
Right.
So, or extricating in any fashion before doing an assessment.
Oh, yeah, right.
Doing the extrication first. Yeah. So you fix that one problem, the score goes away. So the numbers aren't so scary when you kind of look at them that way. What's making this number what it is? What do we need to do to fix it? What's going to get that number up to the highest level, the fastest possible, by knocking off either the most serious thing or the things that are most commonly done.
Yeah. Iterated reliability amongst the Round Robin CQI regime. How do you monitor for that? So, GNA, there's a whole interrelated reliability program where you're constantly monitoring the QI, the auditors and the QI coordinators and all of that. So we're all on the same page. Standards, policies, all of that.
Yeah.
One person calls the shots.
Yep.
But in these Round Robin CQI kind of profiles, how do you account for that? How do you make sure that that Kelly and Gerard are actually reviewing the same
Yeah.
things. And
Yeah. So again, that goes back to your overarching supervisory role of the CQI process. If you just, and again, what we see often is that chief of department X goes to his 4 captains and says, "You're gonna do the QA for your group, or the group, the other group, review their own reports," type of thing. But you need to have some sort of management structure that oversees that whole CQI process. And part of that is to audit the auditors. So we actually audit our auditors every trimester, just like with the paramedics, and provide them with the same type of a report where we have a senior auditor review their stuff and look to see whether they're doing it the way we want them to do it, and whether there's, on the subjective side, are they being overly harsh, overly critical, under harsh, under critical. And then we meet with them and go through their data with them. We do the same for coordinators. We look on the back end and we see how an agency's scoring, where we look for critical areas where we know that if a coordinator is not working properly, that scores won't improve if they're not delivering the right message the right way. So we do a lot of back-end data analysis of our people to make sure that they're doing the job properly. We don't just cut them loose and say, go talk to people, good luck, and let me know if you have any problems, which is how a lot of the round robin systems kind of operate. So you need that infrastructure. And that's why when I was talking earlier about EMS underfunding EMS, CQI, it's not just hiring that guy or that gal to go and be the CQI coordinator. Okay, we're going to invest in a salary for a full-time CQI person. We're done. we fixed the QI problem. You have a whole infrastructure that needs to be put into place to make sure that person's doing the right job. Make sure that, because we've had calls with that's the case too, where I had an agency just 2 or 3 weeks ago. They have 3 CQI coordinators in their organization, and they feel that all 3 are not doing their jobs. Mm-hmm. That they're just letting things slide, that they're working on relationships. If it's a buddy of mine, I let them get away with things. So there's no oversight, or at least improper oversight, to monitor for that, to make sure that those folks are doing their job properly. In order to do that, you've got to have some structure like a committee that has multiple opinions, different people, and especially a medical director on that group that can watch the overall performance of the CQI process. So you got to watch the watchers, right? Just to make sure everybody's doing a good job and nobody can, phone it in, that stuff's actually getting done. You've got to have mechanisms to be able to monitor for that.
Yeah, well, that prospective client can solve all those problems with a 6-day trip to an NAEMSP EMS CQI certification program, or 6 days at the United States National Fire Academy in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and that'll take care of that. But what it won't take care of, Paul, is what happens when you and we're QIing each other's Boeing bolt suppliers and administrators, and we fuck something up. Mm-hmm. Right, the door falls off, hypothetically. Right,
yeah.
All right. At some point, someone's got to pay the piper.
Yeah.
And how does in a round robin CQI where we're all palsy wowsies and we don't want to screw each other over.
Right.
We got relationships, we got biases, all of that. How do you hold account somebody that, hey, is using the wrong screwdriver, using the wrong bolt, and the doors are fucking flying off?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, you've got to have that management oversight, and they've got to have their ear to the ground with the staff. What's really going on? Is your CQI coordinator delivering the service that they should be to help you be a better provider? So the communication goes in both directions, right? It's just not a top down and, here's how we're going to do things. You've got to really listen to the people out in the field and hear what the end product of that CQI process is and whether it's working or not, and listen to your CQI folks, right? So if they're telling management, we need to bolster a certain activity or something in our system that's not working effectively, causing errors and issues, you got to listen to them and you got to support them. So it's going to be a two-way communication street. Everybody has to have respect for everybody else's position and their opinions, and you need to factor that stuff in when making decisions about your CQI process.
It's all about trust, and that relationship between the paramedic and the CQI officer or the CQI committee. We've said this from day one. That's the most important relationship, and everything evolves out of that.
Absolutely. That's where the rubber hits the road.
That's it. So, all right, let's dovetail this. And what do you got to lead us out?
All right. Well, I think there's two things. Round Robin has a lot of weaknesses when you have multiple people with their fingers in the CQI pie providing feedback back to your individual field providers. If you're going to use that for its benefits, you have to make sure you mitigate the risks. So you got to look at the downside of using that system and come up with something that'll fix that. When you get to that level of construction in your CQI process, where you have to build all those things in that we just talked about, get a more active medical director, have a committee involved, have your two-way communications up and down the ladder, all the education that goes with it, then you have to commit financially to the CQI process that it is worth your resources, your time and your money to invest in CQI so that your patient care is truly top-notch. It requires a commitment. So that needs to be done. If you decide that Round Robin has too many risks, then you can use other methods, but you still have to have some of those same mechanisms in place to make sure that you're doing the job correctly. And if you can't manage that yourself, then you need to have an outsider do it for you. You need to look to bring in somebody who can do that for you. When you add, the cost of having an outsider and compared to your internal costs, you want to make sure you measure that against your internal actual real costs, not measuring, well, I've got Kevin in the basement reading run reports for $4 an hour. So it costs me $500 a year and coffee every morning to have Kevin be our CQI coordinator. That's not the real cost of doing CQI seriously. So whether you build your own in-house system or you contract out, you want to make sure that you fully understand the implications of building a solid CQI program, and then the results will pay off for you. And not only in terms of good patient care, but we've talked about as well that it can increase your bottom line because calls that should be ALS will get ALS, calls that shouldn't be refused won't be refused, and that can positively impact your finances as well. So the last thing is, as to sum up and answer your question, is make sure that you construct the CQI process properly and then allocate the proper resources to get the job done properly.
All right. Well, there you have it, folks. The trials, tribulations, and the risks, hazards associated with Round Robin CQI. If you want to learn more about how to mitigate those risks, check us out at www.gerardassociates.com. Hey, check out the rest of our podcast venue on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Tumblr, Tubler, whatever it is. We appreciate and we're grateful for you listening to us. Have a great day, everyone.
Goodbye, everybody. Have a good day.
On 5.